Many of the greatest legends in American history are stories from Maine. And, since today's stories are the histories of tomorrow, our people, places, and the events of today, can become the icons and legends of the future. And now, the story of the 27th Maine Infantry of Volunteers, and their 867 Congressional Medals of Honor.
On September 10 of 1862, in answer to President Abraham Lincoln's call for an additional 300,000 troops to serve a 9-month enlistment and defend the Union, a regiment of volunteers was raised in York County, Maine. This national conflict was referred to by some as the War of Southern Rebellion. We all know it today as the American Civil War. When these 1,000 men of York County arrived for basic military training in what is today South Portland, Maine, they felt as if they were about to embark on a great adventure. These York County farmers, fishermen, woodsmen, merchants, and laborers trained, drilled, and learned the military discipline that would now rule over their daily lives. By late October of 1862, just as morning temperatures were turning much colder, these men of the newly formed 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers began the long journey to Washington, where they would be charged with defending the nation's capital. When the 27th arrived in Washington just a few days later, they found a heavily defended city replete with infantry, artillery battalions, sharpshooters, and naval forces who patrolled the Potomac. For these Maine men of York County, the war thus far showed little signs of being bothersome. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were just across the river in the south, which seemed 100 miles away. Once they finally arrived in the capital, what they discovered must have raised their hopes. The city of Washington, D.C. was resplendent with much color as red, white, and blue bunting was displayed from every window, every doorway, light poles, fences, and any place where ribbons or bunting could be affixed. Well-dressed men and beautifully dressed women twirling parasols in the warm fall sun all filled the streets and were busy going from one place to another. All of the uniformed soldiers and sailors each saluted as they passed superior officers or tipped their hats before passing the many women they encountered. Yet, all of this hoopla and decoration betrayed the 27th's true surroundings. Trenches were dug in all around the capital. Fences with spears pointing outward to prevent a rush of enemy troops formed a ring on the periphery of the city, while walls of stone, dirt, and sand piled up as breastworks before the cannons. It was a strange sight to see all of the city's merriment surrounded by the implements of war. For the men of the 27th, this city, this seat of our nation's government, seemed the perfect place to serve a 9-month enlistment. Theaters and public houses were open and dining halls were serving up a tremendous business. An off-duty soldier or sailor could really enjoy his enlistment in Washington. Much like all of the troops in all of the regiments guarding the capital, their days were filled with drilling, practicing the military art of formations, marching, saluting, shooting practice, and a lot of waiting. Waiting for new orders, waiting for something different to do, and waiting for an enemy to show themselves. Every day was filled with the same manner of duty, but each evening proved a social dream as men were granted leave to partake of Washington's busy nightlife. Music filled the night air as local musicians played in social settings, and their sounds filtered out onto the sidewalks. Street lamps were lit, while the illumination from the homes, hotels, restaurants, government buildings, and nearby encampments all provided a festive, well-lit and party-like atmosphere. Even the encampments of these regiments were seen as pleasant enough. These men would enjoy card playing, high-spirited discussion, arm wrestling, and even musical interludes, by which to entertain themselves. Though men were dying in the rancor of battle, just a few miles away, these men of the 27th had found a Garden of Eden, a heavenly place to serve their 9 months in the Army of the Potomac. But as the spring of 1863 brought a new flush of green to the fields and blooms to flower beds, all of that daytime boredom and evening exuberance was about to be challenged, and what would come for the 27th Maine Infantry of Volunteers would fill the pages of American history. By June of 1863, the 27th was preparing for a return home to Maine, as their 9-month stint in the Union Army was about to expire. But Trouble was brewing, and United States Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, was asking the 9-month volunteers in the Maine regiments to remain longer than they had signed up to serve. Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were on the move and had pierced northward into Pennsylvania. Stanton knew he needed to retain Union strength in the capital at Washington and might need to siphon off many of the well-rested capital defenders to bolster the fighting troops who were shadowing Lee's army. A fight was coming, and like a pending hurricane, preparations were being planned. The Army of Northern Virginia had proved to be a formidable enemy, and despite a superior Union strength in many engagements, these Southern rebels still handed the Army of the Potomac astounding losses on the many fields of bloody battle. When the men of the 27th were asked to remain beyond their 9-month enlistments, approximately 300 agreed to remain in Washington, while nearly 700 Maine men of the regiment chose to return home. By July 1st of 1863, Confederate forces, blind to the fact the Army of the Potomac had been shadowing their every turn, clashed with Union troops at Gettysburg. It was soon obvious to military commanders on both sides of the conflict that each side was building up strength, and all were converging on Gettysburg. Many of the troops of the regiments guarding Washington were being routed to the field of action to bolster the Union Army, which was forming a 3-mile-long line of battle. The coming fight between these two behemoth armies was about to unleash Armageddon. While 2/3 of the 27th had already returned to Maine, over 300 who chose to remain prepared for a battle that might result in the fall of the United States should Lee's army defeat the Union at Gettysburg and then march upon Washington. For the next 3 days, the fighting at Gettysburg was unceasing. The clash between rebels and Yanks would become legendary. On the second day of battle, and while Maine's 27th stood guard over the American capital, Maine's 20th Regiment of Infantry Volunteers, bolstered by 120 men of the 2nd Maine Regiment and the 16th Maine Sharpshooters, clashed with Lee's forces on a small hill at the extreme left of the Union line at a place known as Little Round Top. For hours, the men of the 20th fought until their ammunition was exhausted as wave upon wave of Confederates charged the flank of the Union line. At times fighting hand-to-hand, at times being reformed into defending lines that seemed to rise and fall and bend and sway under the bloody and deadly mortal combat. Eventually, Maine's Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had played out all of his tactics as the men of the 20th found their ammunition had completely exhausted. But another wave of rebel attacks was about to challenge the Union Blue once more, and the fate of the Union Army was about to meet a crushing blow. On the extreme right, some 3 miles away, the extreme right of the Union line, the exact opposite of Chamberlain's left position, was commanded by Maine's General Oliver Otis Howard and his 11th Corps. But the defense of the right had collapsed under the crushing force of Lee's army. Should the Union left also be crushed, the fate of the Union Army of the Potomac would be overwhelmed and defeated. Should the 20th fail, it would be up to the 27th and the other capital defenders at Washington to defend the American Union in one last and final battle. Chamberlain knew the gamble, and he realized what was at stake. Yet, his men were exhausted, their ammunition was gone, and another wave of rebels were advancing upon them. That was when Chamberlain ordered his 20th Maine to affix bayonets and charge downhill headlong into the maelstrom of the oncoming rebels. This bayonet charge down Little Round Top surprised advancing rebels, many of whom dropped their rifles, swung about on their heels, and ran for their lives. When it was over, the 20th Maine stood tall and in full command of the field of battle. Chamberlain's boys from Maine took 400 Confederate prisoners, crushed Lee's plans to open a road to Washington, and saved the Union from certain defeat. Chamberlain's order of a bayonet charge even surprised his own superior officers. When word reached Washington of the failure of Lee's army to crush the Union forces at Little Round Top, the 27th were able to breathe a slight sigh of relief. But the battle on the outskirts of Gettysburg wasn't yet over. On the 3rd day of July, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had reformulated his plan and designed an attack that would even astound his own commanders and troops alike. Lee knew he had crushed the right of the Union line, and he was positive that he had severely weakened the extreme left, despite the fact that his men were defeated there the day before. Lee was sure the Union commander, General George Meade, would bolster his weak flanks on each end of the defending line of battle. And Lee was certain that Meade would pull troops out of the center of the Union line in order to strengthen those embattled flanks. Lee called upon one of his top commanders, General George Pickett, to lead a massive 15,000-man force to charge the Union center, break the defending line, and crush Meade's Union forces. 150 cannon began the nonstop assault on the Union line, just as Pickett's charge marched over open land toward the Union center. When Pickett's troops approached the Union blue, the cannonade ceased and the clash of Southern gray and Union blue began. Directly in this melee was the 20th Maine, who had been rewarded with a rest after their defending action at Little Round Top. These exhausted men of Maine were placed in reserve at the center, where it was thought to be a quiet and unthinkable place for attack. When the charge of the Union center was over, Lee's army had suffered an astonishing defeat. Lee's forces suffered more than 7,000 total casualties, with nearly 4,000 surviving rebels captured. The Battle of Gettysburg had finally ended. Lee's army was now retreating back into the South, and the tide of the war had changed. The Union had been defended, the capital at Washington was safe, and the men of the 27th, completely untested in battle, could now breathe easy. On July 4th, the very next day after the Battle of Gettysburg had been decided, the men of the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers were relieved of duty and marched out of Washington for a trip back home to Maine. All of the enlistments of the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers and their time in the Union Army was now over, and so you would think would also be the end of their story. When the war had finally concluded with a Confederate defeat and surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in April of 1865, the United States of America was scarred and completely changed. Finally, the Southern states who rebelled and seceded from the American Union were now being welcomed back into the fold. Slaves all across the United States were now free. Many cities and towns had been completely destroyed, and the toll of death was racked up in excess of an unbelievable 620,000 lives. When the dust settled, and while monuments were being erected in every town, city, and state, all dedicated to the lives lost in the battles that took place, many medals were being awarded. Most of these awards were given posthumously for exemplary service and feats of courage, daring, and leadership. For the next few decades, as reports and stories were reviewed, Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded. Approximately 1,522 Medals of Honor were awarded for service during the American Civil War. But the most ever awarded to one regiment would even surprise a grateful nation. When over 300 men of the 27th Maine agreed to remain in defense of Washington, despite their enlistments having expired, War Secretary Edwin Stanton promised to award the Medal of Honor to any man who remained in service beyond their expiration. But a clerical error failed to record the name of the men who remained in service. However, Stanton had made an agreement. Not able to accurately identify those who deserved the award that was promised, Stanton chose to leave it up to the 27th's former commanders to choose the recipients. So, Stanton sent 867 medals to the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers, which was, as Maine author and historian John J. Pullen called it, a shower of stars.
Lori Suzanne Dell's books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, The Legends Continue, and all of her books, are available through all major bookstores and through Amazon. And you can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify.